American energy will power this future. We have become an energy exporter for the first time ever.
We produce more oil at home than we have in 15 years. We produce more natural gas than ever before. And nearly everyone's energy bill is lower because of it.
40 years ago, these were the images that rocked the U.S. Now, America has gone from energy crisis to energy success.
Powered by new innovation and technology, we are now on the cusp of a true energy revolution.
And it's all thanks to shale.
Our base case is for shale to grow 7 million barrels per day between now and 2025. That would make the U.S. the largest oil producer in the world.
And it was small, independent risk takers that got us here.
I basically fought Wall Street for 25 years. They always want something sexy.
And their bet paid off.
Did you ever think you were going to be where you are today?
Not at all. I didn't dream that far.
Now, big oil wants in.
Shales is very important to Shell in terms of a future growth opportunity.
And with the majors' help, fracking could go global.
I think we have everything in place for the revolution to happen here.
But fracking shale rock isn't without problems.
Unfortunately, there's another group of actors in industry who tend to spend more time investing in lobbyists trying to convince policymakers that the problem really isn't as big as we think it is.
Can environmental and regulatory risks extinguish shale's dominance? Or are we on the cusp of the next shale revolution?
Shale production is flat out a game changer.
Ryan Zinke is the Interior Secretary for the current administration, and he's in charge of much of the oil and gas development and regulation.
Just to open up the potential of America never being held hostage by a foreign nation again and having the ability to be energy dominant. That means having our domestic productions up, being not only energy independent, but having the ability to be energy independent and provide the world with clean, affordable, abundant energy, and done right is an enormous opportunity. And fracking and the shale play is essential to that.
The shale revolution would be nowhere if it weren't for the independent producers like Continental and Pioneer, who use new technologies to tap oil reserves the rest of the world wrote off.
It's the ingenuity of the U.S. independent that we keep trying, whether it's high oil prices or low oil prices. We keep trying new technologies to try to get it right.
Here's how it played out. In the 1980s, there was a big crash in oil prices. They went from $30 to $10 a barrel. Jobs were lost, production fell. As the industry recovered in the late 90s, there was a wave of consolidation which created the super majors we know today. And those companies ditched their U.S. assets and went overseas.
They thought they were leaving the high-cost production basis in the late 90s and the early 2000s, but instead they left the low-cost production basis. And so they left it to the U.S. E&Ps that bought these assets off of big oil in the late 90s and early 2000s. And these companies today are the big names in the shale revolution.
The independents needed to find a way to make U.S. oil work. They turned to new technology, which opened up reservoirs and lowered the drilling cost.
We proved that horizontal drilling in thin bed reservoirs, was kind of the cat's meow. It made it work, and it made it work very well.
It worked so well that U.S. energy production soared 130% in 9 years. And now it's big oil's turn.
I believe the majors will continue to move into the Permian Basin big time. They will have to acquire companies over time because they have to. Anytime you have a basin that's going from 2 million barrels a day to 10, the majors will have to be there.
Fracking. It's the oil drilling process that's doubled U.S. production over the last 10 years, changed the global market, and led the U.S. one step closer to energy independence. How does it work? Over hundreds of millions of years, miles below the surface, rocks soaked up oil and natural gas, trapping it underground. Fracking creates tiny cracks in the rock that freeze up that oil. First, you drill a vertical well into an oil reserve. Then, drill an arc and continue to create a horizontal well that extends into the heart of the oil reserve. Once the hole is drilled, a steel tube lines it. Then cement is pumped down and settles between the pipe and the well wall, creating a protective layer between the well and earth. Then you frack. A perforating gun punches tiny holes through the steel, cement wall, and rock. Then a potent mixture of sand, water, and some chemicals is pumped down into the holes to create small cracks in the rock. The sand holds the cracks open so oil and gas can flow out. An average Permian well uses almost 12 million pounds of sand and 11.5 million gallons of water. That's enough water to fill over 17 Olympic-sized pools. A vertical well gives you just one shot to strike oil, but a horizontal well allows you to frack multiple times along the lateral. That means more oil for less work. In the 80s, George Mitchell, known as the father of shale, first pumped this mixture into a vertical well in the Barnett Shale in Texas. His technique spread throughout all the major shale areas from Texas to North Dakota. And companies continued to innovate, now drilling multiple wells in one small area with pipes going in different directions underground. In fact, they can produce a barrel of oil for half the cost of what they did just 4 years ago. The more efficient companies get, the more oil the U.S. produces. The U.S. is close to overtaking Saudi Arabia as the world's top oil producer, and it's all thanks to fracking. In this next hour, we take you deep into the world of shale, the risks, the technology, the role of big oil, and the wildcatters who made it all happen.
We knew that it was a huge breakthrough with what we were doing. We didn't have any idea that it would be this extensive. We had used kind of a pump and pray method.
Pump and pray?
Pump and pray.
Harold Hamm and the other wildcatters like Scott Sheffield pumped and prayed while taking big risks in the oil patch.
We were hung out on a limb for a small company. We leased 250,000 acres, on the bet that this was going to happen, was going to make this work.
Now, his portrait hangs in Oklahoma's Hall of Fame, where he's called the Great American Wildcatter. But back in the 90s, no one was buying in.
And it was a little hard to get the market to believe what we were doing.
In the 90s, the oil industry was just coming out of a terrible crash, and shale drilling was a money pit. Most producers wouldn't touch it, but Hamm thought it just might work.
I wanted to find really large fields. And so that's why we went to the Rockies, and that being primarily North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and started looking for oil.
So, did people think you were crazy?
Pretty much at that time. In fact, of all the operators there in Montana and North Dakota, we were the only ones basically to tackle it other than one other company.
Burlington Resources and Continental developed the whole 75-mile field in Cedar Hills in the mid-90s. With horizontal wells, others were afraid to try.
We knew that it was a huge breakthrough with what we were doing. We didn't have any idea that it would be this extensive.
What was the moment where you realized, ha ha ha, I win?
Well, in this business it takes a lot of faith and perseverance. And so we believed it strongly enough that we actually started with two rigs at once. And so anyway, it came in 700 plus barrels per day, initial production off the well, which was at that time, very economic.
So
it was a great discovery.
That was the moment. How did it feel?
That was the moment. It felt wonderful. Up till then, we were really hung out on a shoestring, if you will. We'd risk almost everything the company had to prove this up. And so it was a really big thing.
Harold then began looking for the next big field. This time, it was the Williston Basin in North Dakota.
We thought, wow, this might work.
Horizontal drilling wouldn't be enough to make the Bakken economic, but using fluids and injecting water into the basin would. It took 18 wells.
Finally, they got something that worked a little bit. When they did, We'd leased quite a bit of land by then, but we went ahead and expanded to lease a lot of the area.
Once Harold cracked the code in the Bakken, it spread down to Texas, where Pioneer had also been trying to make shale work.
We were drilling test wells in 2006 through the Eagle Ford and taking samples and noticed in that shale that had huge potential. So we made the decision to refocus the company, sell off all the international assets, sell off all the Gulf of Mexico assets from 2006 to about 2011, and focus our entire staff on the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford in South Texas.
It took Pioneer 3 years to find its first discovery in the Eagle Ford.
You just don't let one well take the risk out of the business, and so we decided to go ahead and drill another 5 wells because the geologists did their homework. We had plenty of core data that we knew that there was recoverable hydrocarbons and it was liquid, mostly liquids, inside our acreage position in the Eagle Ford. The biggest fight was that Wall Street always wants something sexy. They want something that's growing fast. They like people who are successful in wildcat exploration. Pioneer probably had a mixed track record.
Eventually, the shale revolution made its way to the Permian Basin in Texas, now the hot shale play where an acre once went for $60,000 a pop.
I remember it exactly as late 2011. It was a management committee meeting, so we hadn't got to the board level yet. It was about a 2-hour presentation, but at the end of the day, they said we had 10 billion barrels of recoverable oil under Pioneer's acreage. And we all just said, you know, it's hard to believe, you know, just, you know, you put a dollar, you know, $2 or $3 or $4 a BOE times that, it's 30, 40, 50 billion dollars.
Now, Pioneer is a $27 billion company. It's producing 260,000 barrels of oil a day, a fraction of its 726 million barrels of reserves.
I'm a firm believer the Permian Basin will add 8 to 10 million barrels a day.
The success of the Wildcatters was fueled by geologists and engineers who mastered the fracking process. Nick Steinsberger worked for the father of shale, George Mitchell.
George Mitchell was so adamant about trying to make the shale work.
Mitchell had amassed a large play in the Barnett. Steinsberger needed to make it economic.
I was trying to develop something or do something to be able to keep my job.
Steinsberger had drilled 6 test wells until he struck gold with the magic application of water, sand, and chemicals.
You start out at very low sand concentrations and ramp up over time. And to be honest with you, that is used in every shale play in the entire world today.
The innovation jump-started the Barnett Shale play. Meanwhile, the Eagle Ford play in southern Texas was still just a white space on a map.
I saw the map up on the wall there, and I said, "Boy, what's all this white space? It's in one of the most drilled places on planet Earth, and there's no production in between production here and production there."
Zinke was a geologist working for Secret Ops Division at Conoco with the code name Côte d'Or.
We can't go out into one of the most drilled places in the world if you're ConocoPhillips and start leasing in an area that's all white space, because as soon as you lease 1 acre, everyone in Texas is going to be leasing around you, because if you're leasing it, there must be something there.
Under disguise, Conoco leased 320,000 acres of land in a play that didn't exist.
They think you were crazy?
Crazy Zinke.
So why did you know you were right?
Well, I didn't know I was right, but I couldn't figure out why I was wrong. There were ups and downs, there always are, right? The very first wells, they did not have very good rates. We had completion problems. We had a lot of technology issues, and that's pretty typical for most plays. But we always knew the resource was there.
Paul had his aha moment in 2007 after setting a world record of 1,100 feet of continuous core.
I said, guys, I just want to let you know that I'm pretty sure we've just found the biggest thing I've ever found in this country.
At its peak, the Eagle Ford was producing 1.7 million barrels of oil a day, one of the most prolific shale assets in the U.S. Technology keeps getting better, and wells keep getting cheaper. Each new rig is producing almost 4 times as much oil as it did in 2014, and for 57% less.
So over the next 10 years, U.S. will be 16 to 20 million barrels a day in a $50 to $60 oil price environment.
But all of that costs money.
We're getting it down to where it's a highly efficient business today. But those costs, everything, all that efficiency costs you. You know, and the type of equipment we're using, the type of drilling rigs we're using, it's very costly. You know, I'm an explorationist, I'm a geologist, so I still believe there's other things to be found.
And so far, all those big bets paid off. Coming up, the Wildcatters created the game, and now it's up to Big Oil.
We're positioning shale as the next wave of growth.
To take shale to the next level.
Should Big Oil be in U.S. shale?
Certainly, they realize it. They missed the boat, and you know, when the ship came in, they were at the airport.
The independents might have created the shale revolution, and now Big Oil wants to cash in.
The Permian is certainly a special asset. It's probably the crown jewel of the Shell portfolio.
Shell is one of the big oil companies ramping up their shale exposure in the middle of the Delaware Basin.
What makes this so awesome?
There's a resource density here that is quite attractive. It's a very thick section. And so you don't just get one shale, you get several shales. And so from an exploration risk perspective, it provides a lot more optionality.
Shell scooped up just over 600,000 acres in 2012 from Chesapeake Energy for $1.9 billion.
We're going to put 4 wells on this pad right next to each other. And this rig can actually walk, meaning it can lift itself up, it can move over without having to pull it apart. So you can imagine we get about 30 to 40% in efficiency increase in terms of time and money, in terms of the rate with which we can drill these wells as compared to doing one-off wells.
Shell's net production is slightly over 60,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day from just 300 wells in the Permian. Its goal is to increase production about 25% a year.
So right here, how much does it cost to get oil out of the ground? What's your break even?
If you'd asked me 3 years ago, it would have been about $65 a barrel. 3 years later, now it's $40 a barrel. We still have much more opportunity to improve. What we're doing in a development mode right now with multi-well pad drilling, you know, we're sub 30.
Shell is spending 10%, a fraction of its $25 billion capex budget, on shale.
We're positioning shale as the next wave of growth. That certainly is going to be a larger percentage of that overall allocation over time.
Many majors bought up shale assets in 2011, 2012. It didn't go well.
It was very clunky early on. We were using a lot of the same standards that we had shaped for our offshore business.
Big Oil was criticized for paying too much at the wrong time and forced to take billions in write-downs after the 2014 crash.
Over the last several years, we have reshaped our standards. We've reshaped our entire framework to enable us to be competitive in shales. We need to be as nimble as an independent, but we also need to bring the strengths of the major, and those strengths are in technology, value chain integration, and scale.
Exxon, Chevron, Total, BP, Eni, Statoil are all in U.S. shale.
Do the big boys coming in make you worried?
No, no, we've competed against the large companies, multinationals forever. It didn't worry me.
Really? They have big pockets.
They do have big pockets, and a lot of times they'll empty them pretty frequently.
Do they have the ability to operate shale like you guys do?
Probably not to the extent that we do, in my opinion, and I think a lot of them realize it. Some of them have made attempts to departmentalize their companies to where they're more like an independent, and that's worked to some extent.
Jeff Curry, head of commodities at Goldman Sachs, is also skeptical.
It's a very different scale. It's a very different engineering proposition. It's more like manufacturing. It's a different skill set than dealing with the international oil arena.
Big Oil is critical in answering the question, how big can shale production get?
We're very early on. I'd say we're in the second or third inning.
There hasn't been a major new oil shale discovery in the U.S. since Scoopstack in Oklahoma 4 years ago. That means to keep shale pumping, you have to get even more oil out of existing assets, and for that, you need technology.
The question is, are we really applying all of the technology that is available to the shale business? And if not, what are the technologies that we could be applying that could potentially change the game in the future?
To advance the game, Shell created iShell, taking existing technology used in other industries and applying it to a shale field.
Wow. All right, so what am I looking at?
You're looking at the future remote operations center where we could be managing and monitoring much more remotely as opposed to doing everything out in the field. So you're using predictive analytics, you're using edge analytics. We're digitizing a lot of what we're doing out here such that the folks in the office can sort out what's going on without having everybody in the field. This button right here.
The futuristic person is freaking me out.
The technology that we're thinking that is evolving allows us to do a lot more fracks for a lot less money and thus recover more from the rock.
The goal? To unlock the full potential of shale.
Remember I told you there's 200 billion barrels in place down there. We're only getting about 8 to 9% of it. If we can increase it by 1 to 2%, that's huge.
What kind of barrels are we talking about with that if you increase recovery 1 to 2%?
You're talking 1% in the Permian Basin is a billion barrels, right?
Coming up, the big risk. What could derail U.S. shale production in the U.S.?
We live in Oklahoma. This is an oil and gas state. What we have asked for is for those who do this to do things in a responsible way, in a good way. They have a very distinctive noise. Sounds like a train or a loud truck or something coming down the road.
I was at home, I was in the shower actually, and it hit and I knew what it was, but I knew this one was different, I knew it was bigger.
Everything was rattling in the house and you wonder if the house is going to stay erect.
It didn't quit and it just kept shaking and getting harder and harder. I just jumped back in bed, just laid there, looked at my wife and she told me this was a big one.
I'm in Pawnee, Oklahoma, in the middle of Tornado Alley, where you don't expect to get hit by an earthquake. But that's exactly what happened to Pawnee over a year ago. The middle of the city was 3 miles away from the epicenter of a 5.8 magnitude earthquake. And the culprit, many experts say, is a byproduct of fracking.
We are standing right about where the rubble was. And
so this is the building that was most affected.
This is the building, and right up there is where the rocks came down.
Brad Sewell is the mayor of Pawnee, a town of about 2,200 people.
Many people did not have earthquake insurance at all. They had been in their houses for many years, and it was just not on their radar at the time. Those that did have earthquake insurance, sometimes the deductible was so high that it did not cover their damage.
Was there any kind of real economic loss because of the earthquake?
We had, I can think of one entrepreneur that was thinking about opening a business here, and after the earthquake she decided she was not going to do that. She was going to try another community. I know the grocery store, they lost a lot of product. You can imagine all the glass, jelly jars and honey jars and things falling to the tile floor, and so they had a huge mess.
This is the headquarters of the Pawnee Nation.
Andrew Knife Chief is the executive director of the Pawnee Nation tribe, which suffered the most damage from the earthquake.
Some of our buildings, the facades of the building looked like they were pretty dang close from just failing completely.
So what am I looking at here?
What you're looking at here is part of the sandstone walls. These are solid sandstone walls. They're about 2.5 foot thick, and you'll see that it's actually sheared and it's cracked all the way through.
Can you quantify how much damage was done to the reservation? Hundreds of thousands?
Oh yeah, I mean over $400,000 damage.
The Pawnee Nation is a small tribe of just 3,000 members and employs just 133 people. They know that oil and gas is a key part of their economy, but don't want to live in fear.
We live in Oklahoma. This is an oil and gas state. What we have asked for is for those who do this to do things in a responsible way, in a good way.
If you're driving in Oklahoma, you're going to pass roads lined with these wastewater disposal wells. And they're at the center of a controversy in the energy community, pitting oil companies against local communities.
When people worry about fracking, right, they often worry about the chemicals that are going down the well. That's only one part of the challenge.
Mark Brownstein is managing director at the Environmental Defense Fund, an environmentalist the oil industry could listen to. The team at EDF have done more than 70 disposal well visits over the years.
As the oil and gas comes up, a lot of this ancient water comes up, and it has the chemicals that you put in there, plus all the constituents that were in that water to begin with. A lot of it is salts and heavy metals, and sometimes even radioactive material. So this all comes up as a soup. And the question is what do you do with this soup?
The industry injects the soup into disposal wells.
That's a relatively safe practice, except what we're finding is the volume of water that you're putting into those wells is beginning to cause seismic activity, earthquakes.
This is Oklahoma. You're not supposed to have those kind of things here.
In Oklahoma, 20 barrels of water are produced for every barrel of oil. And the more production grows, the more bad water you get. In 2015, there were almost 900 earthquakes in Oklahoma. In 2007, before fracking took off, there was just one.
I think that all the circumstances together, it's a ticking time bomb.
Pawnee Nation has taken Eagle Road Oil and Cummings Oil to tribal court.
We identified those two energy companies as the energy companies that disposed of the most volume of water under the highest pressures. Their wells were linked to the September 3rd earthquake, the 5.8 earthquake, and so that's why we identified them.
And what's your end goal in that lawsuit?
Our end goal is we want an alternative to the Type 2 disposal wells, because I don't know about the rest of the country or even the rest of the state. What I do know about Pawnee, where our jurisdiction is that if you dispose of wastewater here, you're going to induce seismic activity, and that's intolerable.
This is the data that we've been working with.
A lot of the responsibility has fallen to state governments. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission has decades of experience in water treatment, but none when it comes to earthquakes.
We never thought that Oklahoma would be the center of this issue.
The OCC began regulating disposal wells in the spring of 2015 after the Oklahoma Geological Survey took a formal position that Oklahoma earthquakes were induced by injection activity in the Arbuckle.
Before I got here, I think, was when the Corporation Commission put out its first order telling people to change their injection wells.
Dr. Jeremy Boak is now the director of the Oklahoma Geological Survey.
As injection went down, you saw a drop in the seismicity. Now we're at a point where we're saying, okay, that injection is beginning to flatten out. Or where are the earthquakes going to flatten out?
Well injections were reduced by a minimum of 40%, and many wells had been shut down completely.
We dropped from having 903 magnitude 3+ earthquakes in 2015 to having 623 in 2016. And then down still further this year to where, depending on if rates change very much, it might be in the 300s.
But 300 earthquakes is not acceptable. One of the big problems we have right now is that there's no agreement in the research community as to the current seismic activity, how much of it is tied to current disposal and how much of it is just the result of years and years of disposing into the Arbuckle and building up those pressures.
I think that the Corporation Commission is going to want to keep tightening down on injection until they're really confident it's at a level that people are comfortable with.
Company pushback on the OCC's directives has been limited, with only 2 court challenges over the past 4 years, both of which were dropped by the companies.
First of all, I don't think there's any legitimate concerns over the environment from fracking.
Harold Hamm, CEO of Continental Resources, is an ardent supporter of deregulation and says issues from wastewater disposal can be mitigated.
Our company is recycling these fluids, and so we're using it over and over and over, and we're up to about 55%. We have a goal about 75% recycle.
We've lifted one terrible regulation after another.
Now the Trump administration has thrown a wild card into the future of federal regulations.
When you look at really what was going on with the prior administration, basically they sought to eliminate oil and gas in America.
You know, frankly, there are some who look at the Trump administration and assume that they don't have to do anything because they now have a government that will essentially, protect them from any future regulation. And I think that's a fundamental misread. I think most Americans want to see America be an oil and gas producer, but they also want to know that America is doing it right.
And as for the people of Pawnee Nation, things aren't so certain.
Do you feel like you're being taken seriously?
I believe that we are, but I also know we live in a dollar and cents world, and so I don't know really. I don't know.
Coming up, can shale production thrive outside the U.S.?
I think we have everything in place for the revolution to happen here.
This is Vaca Muerta. It's the biggest place outside the U.S. that's producing shale, and it's Argentina's answer to the Permian.
Do you think the next shale revolution can happen in Argentina?
Yes, no doubt. I think we have everything in place for the revolution to happen here.
Vaca Muerta is in the Neuquén Basin in Argentina's Patagonia region. The formation covers 12,000 square miles and has 5.2 billion barrels of oil equivalent that can be produced in the future. That's just 11% of what can be produced in the Permian.
The quality of the rock is, in our opinion, better than the U.S. It's very thick, and probably the productivity of those areas are 3 times the productivity of the areas that you have in the Permian or Eagle Ford.
Argentina's majority state-owned energy company, YPF, is leading Vaca Muerta's development. They own almost 50% of the region and produce 64,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day. And YPF chairman Miguel Gutierrez is optimistic.
By 2020, we will double the production from Vaca Muerta.
If the Permian is in the 3rd inning, then Vaca Muerta is still in batting practice. YPF ramped up development in 2015, years behind the Permian, and their wells were expensive.
If you go and see how the U.S. market started and the pace at which they developed, I believe that we will reach to that point, probably starting in year 5 or 6 from now.
I'm standing on one of 2 rigs here in Lama Campana, and this rig's going to drill 6 wells. Each of those wells could produce 800,000 barrels of oil equivalent over its lifetime.
Pablo Bizotto was just promoted to run YPF's entire upstream operations. Before that, he was the head of Vaca Muerta, and he says the key to success is development costs.
Our development cost is around $13 per BOE, and our objective for the next year is reach out $10 per BOE.
Why is $10 BOE so magical?
Because this value of development cost put Vaca Muerta in a competitive position with another shale development.
So you could be competitive with Permian and Eagle Ford in the U.S.?
Yes.
The goal is to hit that magic number by 2020, which would still be 2 years behind schedule. One problem is logistics. Translated into English, Vaca Muerta means dead cow. And walking around the region, you can understand why. It's barren with few paved roads, unlike the U.S. So YPF has to use technology to catch up with its peers.
We are reducing our development costs by the geosteering technology.
YPF has control rooms to operate remotely. A geologist and an engineer sit together to monitor drilling a well. And once it's producing, engineers will stay in the control room 24/7 to monitor its progress. Out in the field, one person could only monitor 80 to 90 wells. From the control room, they can monitor 250. And these changes are critical to attracting capital. YPF has the land, but they need the experience and money, and that comes from big oil.
Frankly, what we are looking for is experience from the U.S., experience from companies that went through the same cycle, or can bring technologies that eventually we don't have here.
Shell, Total, Exxon, and Chevron are all in Vaca Muerta, and YPF hopes they invest billions.
There are more than 15 companies operating in Vaca Muerta.
Juan Jose Aranguren is Argentina's energy minister, and he has high hopes for the region.
I reckon that we will start moving from, let's say, $4 or $5 billion per year to around 15 by 2021, 2022.
And a key piece to that is labor reform.
There have been some extra charges that the union leaders have agreed to reduce in order to become more productive. And in the end, we reckon that nearly 20% of the current costs can be reduced as a consequence of the new agreement that has been reached.
President Macri's administration has relaxed labor laws that once crippled energy companies in Argentina.
In future, there will be a better understanding between companies and the unions in order to see exactly how many hands you will need in order to perform an activity.
The hope is that reform will put billions of investment on the table, but others are not so optimistic.
The conditions outside of the United States, in places like Argentina, are not the same. Is it going to be easy to develop? The answer is no. The U.S. had the perfect conditions. Outside of the U.S., Argentina, Middle East, and Russia, you don't have that same type of environment to attract capital.
Argentina isn't America, and political risk does run high.
What reassurances can you give them that what you do during your time here will remain once you're no longer in office?
Well, that's the reason why the country or the people in my country have decided to change the administration.
They could change it back.
Of course, of course.
So what happens if they change it back?
Well, energy business is a risky business. The same happens in many different countries in the world. And of course, this is something that can change in the future. And when you talk about the country risk, this will be taken into account by investors.
With most majors on board, Argentina hopes to now entice the small independents and private equity money that forged Shale's success in the U.S.
I have discussed this issue with Rick Perry, with the Energy Secretary of USA, because we need also to see opportunities with American medium-sized companies coming to Argentina to develop Vaca Muerta. And this is something that we need still to work hard in order to make this as an opportunity for the country.
Would you ever go to Vaca Muerta?
You know, there's a lot of political risk. Anytime you go to another country, you go down and develop the technology and the oil fields and everything, and what happens? You know, government just can't help themselves. They just have to nationalize it.
So you'd be scared to go to Argentina?
I think, you know, shareholders don't like to be put at risk.
And the real test for Vaca Muerta will be in the next 5 years. YPF wants to grow shale production by 150% and cut development costs by 25%. Can it live up to the hype?
I'm sure that by that time there are 6 gas pipelines connecting us with the neighboring countries. I hope that in 5 years' time some of them will start flowing natural gas to the neighboring countries. Our aim is to secure energy for our country, secure energy for the southern tip of Latin America, and thereafter the following 5 years will tell us if there will be opportunity to export elsewhere.
And the world is watching. If YPF can pull off significant development of Vaca Muerta, it will prove the shale revolution can thrive outside of the U.S. And if not, it could stunt shale's growth. Coming up,
it's the largest resource that remains on the planet.
How the U.S. shale revolution changed the world.
President Trump will fuel America's future and become the first president to achieve American energy independence.
Here's what energy independence really looks like. It's the U.S. becoming a net exporter when exports overwhelm imports. Currently, the U.S. is exporting about 2 million barrels of oil a day, a far cry from the 8 million barrels of oil that we're currently importing. Now, experts think by 2020, the U.S. could cross that line, and that has huge implications. One implication is the trade deficit. 20% of the trade deficit is tied to energy. Now, this is the U.S. trade balance adjusted for price. In the early 2000s, the trade deficit was almost $25 billion. Now, it's less than $10 billion. Keep reducing that, it does a lot to GDP. And on a very basic level, it's good for growth, jobs, and for you at the pump. Some experts say the shale revolution saved an average household $200 to $300 a year as lower gasoline prices hit $2 a gallon. That means more money for you to spend. And if there's one thing everyone can agree on, it's that shale means lower oil prices.
The increase of nearly 5 million barrels a day of U.S. production was not the only, but probably the largest contributor to one of the steepest oil price collapses in history.
Prices fell from $107 a barrel in 2014 to $26 in February of 2016, the steepest decline since the financial crisis. And now, the world needs to adjust to $50 oil.
The biggest impact on oil-producing countries like Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, many others, certainly Venezuela, which was already in economic chaos, is not that the U.S. doesn't physically need their oil, but that this dramatic increase in U.S. oil production helped to collapse the world price of oil. That loss of revenue has been a huge source of strain for oil-dependent countries.
Saudi Arabia might be able to produce oil for $20 a barrel or less, but it needs $70 to balance the books.
I'm OPEC. In the old days when I could control prices. If I cut production and let prices rise, and I knew these guys haven't been investing, it would take them 5 years to get on production.
The price rise we expect to see in oil won't come about over a 20 or 30 year period that people used to think about, and has huge implications for some of those major oil producers.
The game changer is the short cycle nature of shale.
Today, I cut production, it takes 3 to 6 months for them to get production online. That is the distinguishing factor. So when we use the word new oil order to describe the current environment, our key focus is on the fast cycle nature of shale.
It means companies can drill more when prices are high and turn off a rig when prices are low. And that creates stability in the oil price.
Say you're an airline. Having predictability of your jet fuel costs are going to help you be able to plan, buy aircraft, develop new routes. And so by looking at the stability that shale can create in pricing, it creates more stability in the economy and a better opportunity in terms of creating more growth going forward.
This stability has forced countries dependent on oil revenue to rethink their entire economy. For proof, look no further than Saudi Arabia's 2030 plan.
Vision 2030 is designed exactly to start to reduce their dependency on oil, looking ahead to this changing nature of the world.
So let's say I had a deep water project that was $75 a barrel. If it's going to be competitive, I got to reverse engineer it such that the cost basis is in line with shale. And I ultimately believe what we're going to end up with is a perfectly flat supply curve, somewhere around $50 a barrel.
This massive shift in the global energy market does come with risk.
Key thing is conventional oil, big oil companies like BP, Saudi Aramco, huge balance sheets. They generally generating in normal times enough cash to pay for their own investments. So they're pretty much independent of banking markets and capital markets on a day-to-day business. In contrast, shale oil, hundreds and hundreds of small mom-and-pop type businesses, highly geared, highly dependent on the banking sector.
U.S. exploration and production companies raised $32 billion in equity markets in 2016 and issued $24 billion of debt. And many of these companies have negative free cash flow and could have for years.
Financial interlinkages act as a sort of massive magnifying effect. They amplify impacts because shocks from one part of the world are then transmitted to other parts of the economy via the banking system. The oil market was largely insulated from that because the major players in the oil market were big oil companies who weren't very dependent on the banks.
The economy saw this play out in the winter of 2016, when oil prices hit a low of $26. The energy industry was hit with a big credit crunch, and the stock market tumbled.
And at some point, you may see either the credit markets, private equity, the banking markets just say, enough's enough. And so I think that's a big issue, is how could the flow of credit and banking flows act as a constraint on the pace at which the US shale markets can grow over the next 10 or 15 years? I think that's a significant question mark.
No matter what happens next, the U.S. has changed the world. It doesn't need to use military might to secure oil from the Middle East. It isn't at the mercy of an OPEC oil embargo, and it will never again be plagued by mile-long lines at gas stations.
And so the US is increasingly moving to a world where they're using energy exports as a tool of foreign policy.
As an industry, we are very early in the kind of exploitation of shale. We're only a decade in.
Our base case is for shale to grow 7 million barrels per day between now and 2025.
The U.S. will get up somewhere between 16 and 20 million barrels a day of oil. And so we could be totally self-sufficient.
It's the largest resource that remains on the planet.
It's like creating a new Saudi Arabia, quite amazing.
I think for sure we'll be the largest producer in the world.